all the really hard things that I've gone through has led to positive change and positive impact. When I was 17, I lost one of my really good friends to suicide. That's what got me into mental health. That's what got me to being a ambassador for Movember. I'm really interested about this space. Being medically retired from rugby league, also a really tough place. But then that led me into studying psychology, and that led me to starting my mental health and sport podcast that I absolutely love and adore. I get to work with professional NRL players who are now leaving the game.
Yeah.
So the advice I would give is just like, it's hard when you're in it, but there is going to be some good that comes out of it.
What's up, folks? Have you ever wondered what it's like to be a sports prodigy and then have to retire early due to injury? That's our next conversation. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop. We're on a mission to unlock human performance. This is the Whoop podcast. Today, Whoop Director of Sports Marketing, Jeremy Powers, is joined by Australia's great rugby player, Keegan Hipgrave. He had a phenomenal early professional career that was unfortunately cut short due to injury. He now talks about mental health and traumatic experiences and how to overcome them. This is a great conversation if you're looking to learn more into the mental health and performance side of life. That is the Whoop podcast coming right now.
Yeah. Keegan, welcome to the show, man. It's great to have you here at Whoop HQ in Boston.
Jeremy, thanks for having me, brother. I'm pumped to be here.
Well, thanks a lot. We have some things in common. We're both retired, and we both used to be athletes.
And you got I think you got a couple years on me, mate. But hey, pumped to be here. Pumped to talk about the retirement. It looks like it's going well for you, man.
I mean, we're both semi-retired. Let's be honest here. Yeah. That was a joke. Like, we're not really retired. Like, we're not retired from life, but we're retired from being out there and beating on our bodies, anyways.
Yeah, but hey, mate, I wouldn't have it any other way, mate. We still get to train. We still get to be around good crew. It's the best.
Tell us about your sport. Tell us a little bit about your story from the top, if you don't mind. Like, going back a little bit. I obviously want to know about growing up in Australia. I'd love to know about the sport of rugby, but I'd like to know a lot about you. So can you bring our viewers that maybe don't know about you back?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. So my name is Keegan Hipgrave. I'm from Australia. Given the accent, I'll say mate a lot, and I'll abbreviate a lot of words. Even coming over here to America, people can't quite understand us what we're saying, but that's all right. We'll make it work. I played a sport professionally called rugby league. There's two main sports in Australia, rugby league and Australian rules. They are two biggest sports. I played rugby league professionally for about 8 years. I loved rugby league. It was what I wanted to do when I was a kid. Growing up in Australia, specifically the Gold Coast, it's a very active lifestyle. So I surfed. I did surf lifesaving. I played rugby. I did water polo. I did a bunch of different sports. My mum and dad, they were big sporting nuts. And similar to yourself, mate, had a lot of energy growing up. So my mum just wanted me to do anything, just to burn out the energy, so I would sleep at night. But rugby league was the sport that I went down. I signed my first professional contract when I was 17, which is, I guess, kind of rare. When you're that age, usually you sort of sign your first pro contract a bit later on. But I was 17 for 4 years. Played for 8 years. Was medically retired. Had too many concussions throughout that time. Rugby league's it's a brutal sport, it's probably closest to American football. So
yeah, that's what I wanted to know. I wanted to know, tell for people that don't know what rugby is in Australia, because it's like, you might be talking about soccer, you might be talking about football, you might be talking about rugby. Break down rugby for 2 seconds.
So if you know rugby, like rugby union, it's kind of similar to that, I imagine, except it's a little bit more stop and start. So two teams of 13. You've got a little ball. It's actually weird to explain. I've never actually explained rugby league before, but essentially two teams. There's 17 professional teams in Australia, spread around the country. It's a very high contact sport. So you're running into each other. There's high collisions. There's a lot of injuries given the nature. We don't wear pads. We'll go into these games, but it's kind of what we grew up with. So it's kind of what you're used to. I know when we first start the season, you've had a couple months off in preseason. You're doing a lot more running and a lot more conditioning. So the first sort of game, maybe the preseason games, your body's a little bit sore, but your body just kind of gets used to the contact, and maybe the back end of the season, you're holding a bunch of injuries, probably similar to yourself in the cycling world. But it's a brutal sport, mate. It is a brutal sport. The average number of games sits between 43 and 46 games.
Okay.
Just for context, there's only 26 rounds in one season.
Yeah.
So For people to play more than 46 games, it's pretty rare,
Okay.
or it's the average. But you see guys that go on and have 100, 200, 300 plus game careers.
Do you score by literally throwing like a touchdown? Like, do you run across the line and then you've got your like tell us a little bit more about rugby just so that like everybody that's listening has a really good sense of exactly what this is, because we understand like tackling and a lot of this like kind of
Mhm.
contact sport heavy, but like how does one win a game?
So it's a great question. To win a game is you score points.
Yeah.
So we would call it a try.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's kind of like a touchdown,
Okay.
but you can't throw the ball forward. So the ball always has to get passed backward, and you have to run across the in goal or the main, I guess, zone at the end of each field, and then you would have to put the ball on the ground. So you
Okay.
can't just run across the line. You actually have to put the ball on the ground.
Okay.
So on the sides of the field, you'll see these really amazing acrobatic guys that will sort of jump outside of the field to put the ball on the ground. So yeah, that's essentially how it works. You get 4 points for a try, and then you kick the ball over there's like 2 goalposts, and then you get an additional 2 points for that. So yeah, the most points win at the end of the game.
It's massive in Australia. Give us a sense of how big this is as like a sport in your in
It,
your country.
it's probably similar to the United States, where certain regions have their sports that are like their diehard fans,
Yeah.
right? So if you're in Australia and you're in probably more the northern end, so Queensland, so like Gold Coast, Brisbane, Sydney, which a lot of people might know, it's diehard rugby league. Like people are obsessed. Like
Mm.
it's the culture. We're Australians, we love sport. But then if you were to go to Melbourne, which was a bit further south in Australia, it's Australian rules. It's a different sport. It's very similar. And I've got mates in both teams, in both
Okay.
different sports, which is really fun. But I grew up rugby league, so I'm obviously incredibly biased. I love the sport. I love still that I still get to be a part of the sport. But that's kind of the dynamic of it all.
You turned pro young. Tell us about how you got into it, why? Yeah, what's the backstory there? Like, I mean, I do want to get to like how you got to where you are today, but I'd like to know a little bit more about how you turned pro. And it seemed like it was quite young and not maybe super traditional in that regard.
Yeah, I think I was bigger than everyone else when I was younger. When I was around 12, 13, I had a lot of success. I had a lot of confidence in like your junior development years. I got picked in all the representative teams, mainly because I was a bigger guy. When I hit about 16, everyone caught up to me. So now everyone's a similar size to me. So I was like, what am I going to do? Because rugby league was always going to be the thing that I wanted to do. While I did have backup plans, and while I was studying outside of rugby league, that was kind of the goal. And so I was just like, well, if everyone's the same size as me now, how am I going to get to that next level? And what's that going to look like? And it looked like training hard, but then also being super competitive. And that competitive aspect kind of looked pretty aggressive, to be honest. Like we play a pretty brutal game. And I had a lot of coaches tell me and probably reinforce that natural aggression. Like I was an aggressive player. I have friends now that say the person you are off the field to the person you were on the field is 2 totally different people.
Uh,
And I put that down to just being so competitive. I just wanted to win, and I wanted to be the best. And so, yeah, I guess I had a lot of success coming through. I got to play all the representative teams at 17 years old. I got offered a contract, which was 4 years, and it was really good cash for a 17-year-old, to be honest. And just for context, like I come from a middle class family, so growing up, I always thought if I didn't have to look at petrol, the price of petrol, and I didn't have to look at my grocery bill, then I'm rich. Like that's a dream, and
I
that's
could only make.
to this day, that's still kind of where I like to sit. But to be offered, a good amount of cash at 17 for 4 years, I know what the next 4 years is going to look like. That's going to take me to 21. That was a really cool thing, and I took that seriously, and that sort of fed into my identity as me being a professional rugby league player. I put everything into that, mate. And just because you sign a pro contract doesn't mean you're going to play in the first team. Most guys don't make they call it like a debut. I'm not sure if it's similar here, but most people don't make their NRL debut until they're probably like, early 20s, mid 20s. And so I was just like, okay, well, I want to do it young. One of my idols, his name was Corey Parker. He did 2 things. He made his NRL debut at 18, and he bought his first house at 18. And I was like, well, if I could do that before I'm 20, then maybe I'll be half the player this guy is. And I was coming into the same team as him. So he was my idol. I was a little sponge. I sort of just like clung to him like a bad smell. And I just learned from him. And he was an aggressive player as well. So we kind of got on. But I had a lot of injuries when I was in that early sort of years. Remember, I tore my hamstring 5 times when I was 19, and this is me trying to make my NRL debut. Like my goal was to do it before I was 20. And I was just remember being so frustrated. And it's not like an ACL or a big injury where you have that one significant incident, then you go back to the drawing board, you'll work on your recovery, you'll get back, and then you'll get back to play. It was like you tear your hamstring, okay, great. Maybe the next time I might have come back a bit too early. Okay, well let's go back to the drawing board and start again. Go through so much hard work, so much rehab to try and get back to where it is, and you think you're going to be good to play, you tore it again.
Mm.
And then I was like, okay, well, I don't want this to happen. This is the third time. I want to make my NRL debut before I'm 20. Let's go to the best, hamstring doctors and specialists in Australia. Let's talk to them. Let's extend the recovery time so I'm really good. Okay, I put everything into it. This is going to be it. I'm going to make my NRL debut. Tear it again.
Yeah.
And so it's a roller coaster, mate. And to be honest, I remember calling my dad after I just tore it for the 5th time. I remember like being on the phone to him, like crying, like, because I was just so frustrated. One of the older boys actually said, he was a guy I looked up to. He's just like, mate, if you're a horse, we'd shoot you. You can't even stay on the field. And
Yeah.
that stung. I've got a journal entry actually about it because I'm a big journaler. And I remember on the phone, like crying, not from what the guy said, but just because I was so frustrated. I wanted to play so badly. And he's like, well, mate, talk to your manager. I called my manager, who is kind of like a mentor to me, Clint Jafosky. And he said, mate, like you're not even 20 years old. Like
Yeah.
take the pressure off. Like most guys aren't making their NRL debut until they're a little bit later down the track. So just take the stress off. We'll go back. We'll do our recovery and we'll just see how it goes. And it was interesting, mate. I actually ended up doing a mid-season transfer to the Gold Coast Titans, which was actually my hometown.
Okay.
It was where I grew up. And in this professional team, these are guys that I had a lot of mates in the team. I was back surfing, which I loved. I had a really good rehab program. And I think it was just a change of environment. I really was enjoying my footy. I loved it. I was 20 at the time, did a heap of hard work. And to be honest, mate, I made my NRL debut at the end of that year, the
Yeah.
very last
With,
game
with the Gold Coast Titans
with the Gold Coast
at
Titans.
20.
Yes.
The big dog, local hometown. We're surfing, but we're also crushing it on the field.
Yeah, man.
What was that like for you? What was that feeling to finally get that moment in your, you had something you've been working on and like putting up on a pedestal for so long?
It's a good question because it's something you work hard towards. I think everyone who, especially in Australia, or I'm sure it's the same over here, you put so much hard work to get to your goal, and that was the goal. And you do it, and it's this euphoric feeling. You've got your friends and family traveling to the game. You've got this little crew in the corner, and you have your family get the photo. And to be honest, like I was only supposed to play 5-10 minutes. Like you're still a young player. You don't get that much time. But we had a heap of injuries throughout the game, and I think I ended up playing 60 out of the 80 minutes of the game, which was hard, mate.
Huge.
It was big, and it was hard, and there was some really big guys on the other team, and me being a natural, probably like a bit of a hothead youngster, I was just like, well, I want to take out the best players on the other team. So me and these big guys, we'd clash heads, and they obviously got it over me because they were in their towards the end of their 20s. But it was a cool atmosphere to be a part of, and that accomplishment, that feeling of achievement, it stuck with me. And I think the best thing I learned from it was like you've just got to do the hard work. Anything you want to get to, you got to do the hard work.
Yeah, that sounds cool. I was gonna ask you what you remembered about it, but it sounds like you remember those dudes.
Yeah,
Being
mate, these
super
are
strong.
big guys. Like
Yeah.
these are big guys, and like I'm not considered to be a big guy in the NRL. I'm considered to be a smaller forward, and a forward is someone who is in the middle, and that's where all like the collisions take place. It's where all the tackles take place. And I was considered to be a smaller guy, so I was like, well, I got to rely on that competitive, aggressive nature to try and be on the same level as these guys. You know what I mean?
Well, if you're just listening to us and you're not watching this, if you were walking down a dark alleyway, and you just saw Keegan alone, you'd go the other way.
Yeah.
He's not a small guy.
I'm not sure about that, mate. I'm not sure, but mate, it's interesting. Like when you finish up footy, because when you're in that environment, you got to eat so much, you got to train so much.
Yeah.
I lost 10 kilos within a couple months of finishing up footy.
I want to know what you guys did for training though, because
Yeah.
this sounds like it would be really interesting to know like what a training regimen for a rugby player in Australia is like.
Yeah, no, of course, it's a great question. So we have like obviously different periods. So you'd have the preseason before the season, then you have the main season, and then you would have your off season. And the preseason is where all your strength and conditioning comes in. You want to be as big and as strong and as fast as you can. There's a lot of speed work. There's a lot of big runs, and there's a lot of weights. So we're probably lifting weights minimum 4 times a week. We're probably doing 2, potentially 3 really solid conditioning sessions mixed with that skills. So it's a ball sport. So kind of like rugby. So we would do a conditioning block, and then rolled into skills. So we want to do those skills under fatigue. And that was a big part of it. We probably wouldn't do so much video session. And that was probably when you have a really good foundation. Leading into the season, pulls probably back a bit because you're playing, one big game a week. You want your body to be as recovered as possible. So we do a lot more video sessions. We'd probably lift only 2 or 3 times a week, but at much lower volumes, depending on how quick the turnaround was. But to be honest, mate, like to get through 26 games in the NRL,
Games are training.
It's brutal. Yeah, the games is training,
Yeah.
and most guys are carrying injuries. Like most of the guys play through it. It's rare to get through a season without having an injury. Like a lot of fans think that you play at 100% week in, week out. It's like, that's not the case at all. Like if you can get to 60, maybe 70% of your best physically, that's a win.
Right.
There's a lot of times that you're playing under 50%, like, and you've just got to hang on for dear life.
Yeah.
And then the off season is the time to get away. We get 6 to 8 weeks off, sometimes 10 weeks off at the end of the season. That's just go decompress, get the body right. If you need to get any surgeries or operations, you usually try and get it at the back end of the season.
It's crazy
and
to think
that's
like
it.
this is regular life. Like, yeah, if I need to get like, I'm going to do my surgeries in the off season. Like, my wife's having a kid. Like, I'm going to also do my surgeries then as well.
Yeah, mate, that was the case, mate. Like, to be honest,
Like just scheduling things like that
Yeah.
seems insane for most normal people. Cause like regular people aren't thinking about like how they, go into surgery to continue to their career.
Yeah, mate. I learned this now since coming out of professional sport. But when you're in that little bubble, like that's all you know. And so I remember there was one time I tore my AC just off my shoulder, and I did it in a tackle in a game. And so I came off, I was done, but then we ran out of players due to injuries, and their injuries was worse than my injury. And so we had to put, the 13 players on the field. So I remember just, I think we needled it, we localed it as much as we can. We strapped it really heavy. So like my right shoulder is pretty much not working. So if I want to tackle, I'm tackling with my left shoulder. And so we went on, we finished the game. We ended up winning the game. It was against one of our really big teams. And it was one of those things where I was just like, it's sort of like when you're in that moment and the adrenaline's pumping, you're not even trying to think about it. It's one of the most painful things I think I've ever done. But you're just in that moment and you're like, you just do anything to play and just to win. Obviously, after the game, that's when all the pain actually really sets in. That was an operation that we sort of pushed back to the end of the season. I tried to play the next week, but I was rubbish. I got, taken off within 5-10 minutes of the game. It was pretty stupid to play anyway. Had a couple weeks off, let the swelling come down. We localed it, we padded it up, we strapped it. And then, that's the surgery at the end of the year.
Savage.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah,
That's the only word I can really use that. I actually want to say, like, first of all, what's going through your mind when you're playing with an injury? Like, as a former athlete, there would be times when you like have to like kind of blank out and go to a place where you're really deep and you're not thinking about the actual pain or this or that. But like, what was that like for you to go one step further on that? Like, if you're in the game but you're injured, like you're willing to give everything for that in that moment.
It's an interesting conversation, hey, because that's all you know.
Yeah.
Like you don't think about what is this going to do to my body 5-10 years later.
Right.
Like that's not even in the conversation, not even a thought, to be honest, because everyone in that room or in that squad, in your team environment, they all have the same thought.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we get there? And if you would have to be in such a place where you can physically not play, and you would actually be worse off for the team to go on the field.
Yeah.
It's just like, if you could do anything to get on that field, that's what you're doing, because you want to play. You want to be there for your mates. You've gone through all the highs and lows with this team, and you want to get to the end goal of winning a premiership. That's the goal. Like, that's the dream. That's every player's dream. And so when you'd have an injury, we're like, oh, what's the best things that I can do to get there? And sometimes it's to your detriment. But, sometimes I've got fingers that will never be the same. You know what I mean? Because I'm sure you've got one as well, and that's why I think a lot of guys come out of sport, and especially if they've been playing for a long time, they really struggle physically. One of my really good friends, like, he can't run.
Yeah.
He can't run more than 2 kilometers. He can walk, but he can't run, and he'll have these injuries forever. And I think it's a catch-22, because while I love rugby league, I would never change that. I'm actually kind of happy and grateful that I got out at a pretty young age, that I'm sure we'll talk about. I left the game at 24. So touch wood, my body's all right now. I've got injuries that I can manage. I can still run, I can still train, I can still do all that. But I've got a lot of mates who are in their 30s, mid-30s, even 40s, and they can't do these things. So it's a balance. I'm not sure if I have the answer to that.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, you give so much and you get to that point where you just wanna see it through. Like, you almost want to die for it. Like, I remember personally making those deals with myself where I'm like, "Cool, I'm good here." Like, we might go careening off the side of this cliff, like, in a sleet and hailstorm, at 12,000 feet in the sky with, like, concrete, roads that are slippery. It's like, "Cool, I might die," and I'm okay with that. Like,
And
I
you
I would make those deals with myself.
and that was a thought process that you had in that time?
Yeah.
That's what see, that is wild for us to think
Yeah.
about. Yeah, that's on a
It's like
whole
you but
'nother
you might
level.
also rip your shoulder off, and you might be like, "All right, like, this is" it's already hanging on by a thread, and, like, what they're gonna have to do to it after. It just sounds like you're making a lot of deals with yourself mentally.
There was a guy, who played, over 300 games. He was an incredible player. His name's James Graham, and he had a very similar mindset to obviously a lot of players, a similar mindset to you. He had a lot of concussions, like some big
Yeah,
knockouts,
I
and he
wanna
actually
talk about this.
which we will talk about 100%. He said the exact same thing, and he had so many concussions, and he said, "Rugby league was my whole life. Rugby league was my whole identity." He's like, "I would have died for it." He's like, "My purpose." He genuinely thought, "My purpose on this earth is to
Mm,
play rugby league."
yeah.
And he had family, he had kids, he had the whole thing. And it wasn't until, he finished up sport and he's just like, "Well, this isn't my whole life. I can
Yeah.
only play till I'm 30, maybe 35 max." And so he went through that whole ordeal as well. But it's that interesting thing where you're in that mind frame. It's like from the people who are listening to this, you'd be like, "There's no way that you'd be willing to die for it." But when you're in the thick of it,
Mm.
and you've got people who are all willing to do the same, you would go to extreme lengths
Well, yeah,
to
it's the
to do
status
that.
quo, it's the
Yeah,
norm.
yeah.
In 2021, though, you had a serious injury. Tell us about how things you had said medically retired, but tell us more about that.
Yeah, yeah. So, 2021, I had a string of big concussions, right? And in the NRL, previously, it used to be a brave thing to do. If you get a concussion, you get back up and you play. Times have changed, especially with all the research and probably the headlines are about coming out with concussion and CTE. But I had some big ones. But in the 2021 season, yeah, I had three big concussions, and the last one being against the Penrith Panthers. It was the last game of the season. It was just before semi-finals, and we were going into the semi-finals. And I remember there was this big guy, Tavita. He was a former teammate. He's actually a good friend. He was running a really hard line. He had the ball, and I was tackling him. And so I had to jam in, and I just came off second best. I had a big contact. The back of my head hit the ground pretty severely. There's a clip around there out somewhere. It's really ugly to look at, to be honest. But I remember just being completely out. I don't remember a lot of that game. I got up, I walked off. After you have a big concussion, you got to do a series of tests in the locker room. So I did all those tests, knowing that if you do have a concussion now, you're not allowed to play for the rest of the game.
Mm.
That's the protocols. They got some really good protocols in the NRL now. And to be honest, mate, I just had a headache. Like I had a headache, and I was just like, "Oh, that's part of the game." I couldn't play the semi-final the following week due to the protocols. As much as I was trying to, they wouldn't let me. But that's probably that next week is sort of when I started to notice a lot more of the symptoms. Like I couldn't train without having this throbbing headache,
Mm.
and I would try and do these really light runs, like we call them like rehabilitation runs, where you would slowly, gradually
Yeah,
build up.
yeah, yeah.
So I'd try and do a little run, and then I would just sleep all afternoon.
Mm.
I'd try and do a really light gym session, and I would just sleep all afternoon, all night. And that was the first thing. And then from there, the season wrapped up, and all the boys would go on their holidays and get their
Mhm.
surgeries and do what they had to do. And I went back home, and I remember just these symptoms started lingering. I had a headache for about 2 months after that last big one. My brain was just obviously still recovering. The biggest thing that I noticed was, my emotions, like
Mm.
that irritability. Like I was
Yeah,
very irritable,
yeah.
just snapping, for no particular reason. I remember being like so happy on cloud nine. This is like I'm with my friends and with my family, and then the next minute I'd be brought down to tears for
Mm.
no reason. And I've been through it before, so I know that my brain was recovering. I knew that was part of it, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you're still going through it. Like I remember
Mhm.
being with my it was my granddad's birthday, and my granddad wasn't doing that great at the time. Probably didn't have many, times left that we would get to see him. And I remember just like being there at this lunch and just being so angry.
Mm.
And I was just thinking of like any other place that I would rather be, and it was just in my own brain. And then I left that, I got into the car, and I remember thinking like, oh, this is probably like one of the last times that I'll get to see him. And I'm just breaking down. I was like, what's wrong? Like, there's got to be something wrong. And then I went to see the neurologist because it was part of the testing, part of the follow up. And I was just completely honest with him to be fair. Like I told him all my symptoms. I told him all the things that were happening with the irritability, with the headaches, the fatigue, just for people who are listening, you go through, a bunch of brain testing, neurological testing, problem solving, literacy, numeracy, reaction time. There's all this whole, it's like a day of testing. And at the end of the testing, it was pretty much like, Keeks, you've had quite a lot of concussions now. You're almost getting to double digits in the professional space. And I know, like, growing up, I'd had way more because that was just what it was like back then. He's like, Keeks, you've got a lot going on outside of footy. I'd finished a Bachelor of Business. I was halfway through my MBA. I was curious about a lot of things. And he's like, I recommend that you should probably medically retire from rugby league. I remember that sitting with me for a little bit and thinking, I want to be a footy player. Like, I wanted to play for my country. While I had an average career, I played 49 games. And as we discussed, an average career is 43, 46. So I just tipped over an average career, but there was so much more I wanted to do in the game. But then I sat down and I reflected, and I was just like, well, hang on. Like, I am curious about a lot of things outside of footy. And to be honest, like, I want to be good when I'm 40 and 50 and 60. Like, yes, from a brain point of view, but also from a body point of view. And so after I made that choice and I had some conversations with my friends and my family, predominantly my family, it came to the fact of, like, I'm not going to try and push back. I'm just going to accept the doctor's advice and medically retire from rugby league.
Hard day.
Yeah, it was tough, man. It was a tough day to make that call. It was a harder day to tell the coach. I remember I was in the pool at the time. I tried to call him straight after that appointment. He didn't get back to me. He's a busy man. But he got back to me the next day. It was the first time I proper said it out loud to anyone. Been told to medically retire. This is what it's going to look like. And he's just like, Keeks. He's like, while we love sport and while we love rugby league, it's not everything. You've got your friends, you got your family, a bunch of stuff happening outside of footy. Like, that's the special stuff. And after that, it felt good. And while there is a mourning period and while it's sad and, there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of media around it, it's like, I'm not going to kick stones. And so what's next? And all the background of, like, working hard and being curious about other things that actually helped me transition out of professional sport to do what I do now. As I was telling you at lunch, I love what I do now. Like, I would not change anything. So while it was a hard time, I wouldn't change anything.
What's up, folks? If you are enjoying this podcast or if you care about health, performance, fitness, you may really enjoy getting a Whoop. That's right. You can check out Whoop at whoop.com. It measures everything around sleep, recovery, strain, and you can now sign up for free for 30 days. So you'll literally get the high-performance wearable in the mail for free. You get to try it for 30 days, see whether you want to be a member. And that is just at whoop.com. Back to the guests.
I've had several friends that have had to stop doing sport, especially in, like, the more dangerous situations because they've been concussed so many times that there's, like, really detrimental effect to this being concussed over and over and over again. And the research continues to back that up, that like, hey, this is not what we're built for, although we're very resilient.
Yes.
This is not at all what our bodies were built to do. And each of them kind of has its own little effect. And we don't know, for some people it's worse than for others, but, like, was it that one experience that made you think, okay, this is where I really need to stop? Or was it the doctor that did it? And then after that, like, you've really now transitioned into, like, mental health and awareness and talking about this story. But I'm curious if there's anything you can say to anyone that would be like, oh yeah, this was the thing that I just, in my head, I knew that this was the time. Or, like, if you're thinking that it's the time, it probably is, like, kind of stuff.
It's a hard way. Obviously, hindsight's a beautiful thing.
Right. That's why but you have that. And some people are saying might not.
I look back now, and I'm not sure why this is, but I feel like all the really hard things that I've gone through has led to positive change and positive impact. When I was 17, I lost one of my really good friends to suicide. That's what got me into mental health. That's what got me to being an ambassador for Movember. I'm really interested about this space. Being medically retired from rugby league, also a really tough place. But then that led me into studying psychology, and that led me to starting my mental health and sport podcast that I absolutely love and adore. I get to work with professional NRL players who are now leaving the game.
Yeah.
So the advice I would give is just, like, it's hard when you're in it, but there is going to be some good that comes out of it. And it's just, you might not be able to see it in that moment, but it is. And I think if you focus on the good things and if you can focus on what you can control, then that'll help. Like, you can't control the uncontrollables. Like, you can't control being medically retired or losing your mate to suicide, but what are the next steps? Like, what is actually going to help not just yourself, but other people, and the ability to make genuine change and genuine impact and move the needle is super important, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't matter if it's your brain or your ACL or your back or whatever, or your L4, L3, whatever like it might be, but
Yeah.
like an injury that's like that's the end of most athletes' careers. It's like
It
you don't get to stop the way you want to, unfortunately,
it's
for many.
It's very yeah, 100%. It would be very rare for someone just to have the most picture perfect career
Yeah.
and be like, "Okay, well, now I'm done." And everyone struggles coming out of professional sport. We've had this conversation before where it's just like, it might not be, the financial piece. It might be the connection piece,
Mhm.
hanging around the right people. It might be the psychological piece. It might be training and navigating what my purpose is and what my employment's gonna look like. So everyone struggles in different ways. But I think, yeah, hanging around good people is a good thing. I think looking for the good in people and looking for like right opportunities. That stuff
Yeah.
helps so much.
So now you've been focused a lot on mental health. You've been telling your story. You've been on the podcast, or you've got your own podcast. You can plug it when
Keegan
you
and Company.
Keegan and
Yeah,
Company.
yeah,
Seems awesome. But you also have a role with your old league, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. And you're helping athletes transition out of this. Tell us about kind of what you're up to and what's going on with that, and a little bit about, I mean, I think we get a sense for the type of person you are, but like what the great part of that job is, because you said you've loved it already. And
Yeah.
we've talked, so I know, but I want everyone to know like how cool that is to be able to help, people maybe that you were friends with or that you played with transition out to
Mm.
see a world that you already are in.
Mate, I'm very grateful to do what I get to do. I study psychology because I want to have the tools to be able to help friends and family first. That was the first piece, I think, of the puzzle when I finished up. Yeah, I think lived experience is great, and while that makes a huge impact, I want to be able the right tools to know what actually works, right? So that was the first piece. The second piece of the puzzle was, well, how do we air these conversations? Everyone who I looked up to growing up were all athletes, and if whatever they were doing, that's what I wanted to do. I come to this realization, well, if athletes who we all look up to, they can be seen, talking about their own struggles and vulnerabilities. And I was like, wow, that's normal. That's fine. And it actually makes it okay for everyone else. And they're giving tools and strategies. And that was a huge learning piece. And so we've had some incredible conversations on the podcast with athletes who we all look up to, predominantly Australian based. Now we've been to New York, and now we're here in Boston, LA next week. And so it's a really fun thing, and that's a great way to create awareness. But for me, the genuine impact and the ability to move the needle in my own community is, I work for like the Rugby League Players Association. So we're kind of like the player union. And my role specifically is to help with players who might be retiring from the game, might be transitioning over to another league. So we've got the UK is big for rugby league. So we have another players. We probably have over 100 players playing in that competition, or players who might just not get a contract. And these periods of transition can be really tough for a lot of players. And so I guess my role is that I'll sit with them, I'll meet with them. To be honest, I know a lot of them because you're in the similar conversation, and why you might not be direct mates, there is a mutual respect there, and you know each other. So we'll sit down and we'll let them know all the benefits and initiatives that they have access to. It might be psychological help, so seeing psychologists. It might be a financial help. It might be career coaching of what they want to do post footy. There's education grants that they have access to, depending on how long they played in the league. Connection events, which is probably one of my favorite things. When you finish up professional sport, there's that sort of sense of where, okay, well, you're done. Like go out into the real world and go figure it out. But it's like, from my point of view in the rugby league community, well, how can we, I guess, bring these players together? So we have about 12 different locations. We call this Keep Fit, Keep Connected event. So in each region around Australia, we'll have like anyone who's played NRL come in. We'll do a gym session at a local players' gym. Then we'll go to coffee and catch up. And we'll do that, once a quarter, 12 different locations around Australia. And that's such a cool piece because you got all these guys coming in that might not have seen each other for a little bit. It's a great way to connect, great way to catch up, to see what other guys doing. How do we help each other's players, like whether that with the cafes or restaurants. The guys are networking, they're hanging out. And it's that connection piece that a lot of us miss. And we do a bunch of different initiatives like that. Like we'll do golf days and reunion events. That piece, I think, is very special.
To dive into that a little further, I'd be curious to know what you think. Retiring from me personally from sport was really, really hard. It's what you live for. I'm curious to know what you think about athletes that are leaving sport and what you see, or what they fear the most, or what you're seeing the most of. Like,
Mm.
man, I just don't know if I'm gonna be able to like do this, or like that's not. I'm never working on a computer. I'm never working a desk job. But like, man, I really need to do something outside, or like, I want to get into like cutting trees down, or
Mm.
my friends have a business that I want to join, or I'm an entrepreneur. Like, I'd be curious to know what you're hearing, and then like how that also relates to regular people as well that are like leaving their careers?
When you're in the professional system, when you're in it, it's kind of is like a little bubble, right? And a lot of guys just think that they'll play forever,
Right.
which is sometimes the case, sometimes not the case. But picture it as like when you're in a professional sporting system or even a corporate world, you're climbing this like a mountain, right? And a lot of the times, or from what I've seen in players who are in it, when they finish up, they think they're just going to jump across to the next mountain. And that might be from a status point of view. That might be
Mhm,
from a financial point of view.
mhm,
That might be whatever point of view you want to look at it, right? But it's actually not the case. It's very few that a lot of people will go into media jobs and will go into, high corporate jobs. What I found is like you've actually got to climb back down the mountain. And you know what? You'll climb the second mountain so much quicker because you've got all the tools and strategies and lived experience from the first
mm,
mountain. And so that you're not going to be on the same, wage that you were on playing professional sport. Like the reality of that is very rare. And I think anyone in periods of transition and are unsure of probably where they want to go, it's just to try things.
mm.
When I first came into professional sport, my mum was like big on academics. So I started doing a Bachelor of Business just because I wanted to keep her happy, to be honest. But I knew that it wasn't going to go forever. And so I was trying a bunch of different things. And I recognize that I am in a position of privilege because a lot of other businesses like to have professional athletes in their organization. So I was curious about cafes. So I worked in a cafe on my day off, just making coffees. I like the idea of potentially owning a restaurant one day. So I worked at a mate's fine dining restaurant, just like helping prep. I like property. I bought my first house at 20. I have a few properties and that was a cool thing. So I went into being a mortgage broker just to understand the system, like brickies labourer, landscape labourers, chippies, tradies, carpenters, like tried all these things. And then when I was medically retired at 24, like I was still pretty young, while I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, I knew everything that I didn't want to do. That's what I tell players now. Like, just be curious. Like, being curious is the best trait that you can get. It might not be what you want to do. We had this conversation before. Say yes to everything. That's the best bit of advice. You just say yes, and then you'll figure out what you actually want to do. Yeah.
Yeah. It's never easy to like make the jump. For most, it's like it's go time. You got to take the jump.
And you get it better than anyone because you've done that. Like you've had the professional,
Yeah.
the sporting sense, and then you've made that transition while it might be a struggle. But now look, you get to be a part of an amazing company. It must be amazing to look back and say, all those hard things actually helped me get to where I am today.
Yes. As an athlete like yourself and as I was, it's like you have a lot of bravado. You hold yourself in a pretty high place in your own little world.
Mm,
And so you do need to go down to come back up. And it's great. That's actually great because you learn a lot on the journey, right? If you look at it like that, then you can get a lot from it. But I think it can be hard.
mm.
But I think it comes with a great reward,
Do you
especially if
think?
you want it.
Yeah, 100. Well, do you reckon that you had high standards when you left the sporting world that you took into your professional career?
Yeah, I do. I think that if you can apply the tools that you take, I think that it really helps and benefits. It's like, hey, you learned a lot and you did a lot in your career, and those same things are going to apply. You just have to you just kind of have to reapply them to new things,
Yeah.
But it's not the same for everyone. It's truly not. It's just not the same for everyone. Like the way that the way that my brain's wired is not the same as yours versus the next rider, or the next athlete, or the next footballer, or whatever it might be. So it's never n equals one. It's always like everyone's a little bit. It's always n equals one. Everyone's a little bit different.
Yeah.
I wanted to just double click on the mental health stuff a little bit and like talk a little bit about how you have continued to push on this advocacy and a little bit about like your journey in that regard right now and like where you're at right now with like, I guess, the mental health and the things that you're doing. What is some of the tools and the things that you're doing on a daily basis that are pushing you or helping you or that you've used to transition or that you're putting onto players and you're teaching them about or programs that you guys have that are helping with people's mental health?
Everyone's different, right? Like everyone has different tools and different strategies that helps them. And to be honest, I'm still learning. Like
Sure.
that's why I want to go study psychology and have conversations with the best athletes around Australia and now the world. I don't think I'm in a position to tell people what works and what doesn't work. Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. But I know me personally,
Mm.
I love being around the ocean.
Yeah.
That's something that really centers me. I'm very fortunate that I get to live on the Gold Coast in Australia, which is right on the beach. So I can wake up in the morning, I get to see sunrise, and I get to go for a swim. Training is a big coping mechanism for me.
Yeah.
I look at the most hardest times in my life, whether it be through relationship breakdown, whether it be from being medically retired. It's usually probably the fittest time that I've ever been. Because I just dive into my training and it's a great way to get away. That might be healthy. That might not be healthy. I'm not too sure. But training is a really good thing for me. I really enjoy meditation
Sure.
and breath work. That's a new thing for me. I sort of dabbled in it a little bit while I was playing professional sport, but it wasn't really a focus for me. I've had a lot of really great conversations with people who meditate and people who do breath work. I've had some really great personal experiences myself, and that's something that I want to do a deep dive into just to center myself and I think be a bit more present. So they're probably the big ones. And probably lastly, like the best thing that helps me, and I know I'm privileged and I'm fortunate, but I've got some of the best mates,
Sure.
like I've got some of the best friends, man. Like I got,
Friends and family is a thing that you can check off on Whoop in your journal, and
yeah,
we do see, like, across the board, like, it really does help a lot of people. Higher recovery scores, more likeliness to be recovering better if you check off, like, friends and family as time that you spent together, so
well, mate, that's actually something that I included in my journal,
Oh,
in my
good.
Whoop journal. Yeah,
I
yeah,
love
yeah.
that.
There's a few things, and that's definitely one of them. Like, and it doesn't have to be like a whole weekend. Like, we talk about being busy, like, and having a balance between work life. I don't need a whole weekend to recenter myself. If I can get a coffee or a surf with a mate in the morning, or do a training session with a mate of an afternoon, like that just gives me so much energy. I think, I don't know if you're similar, but I do get a lot of energy from people. I think very, very social, and I really got a lot of love from my friends. You know what I mean? And fortunate because I know there's a lot of people who might not have similar networks, and I don't know if I'm in any place to give any advice, but I think if you can hang around places that you enjoy, whether that's the gym, whether that's cycling, whether
Mm.
that's even your like company, the people who you resonate with or might have similar values to, there's probably the people that you're more likely to be drawn to anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so you're going to school, to get a degree in psychology, and I think the other thing that I've really gained from our conversations over the last days and getting to spend this much time with you is that you're a man of people. You, like, really like to help people. I think this role that you're doing today is, like, probably really feels like a personally, like, yeah, I like this work because I also really like to help people, but psychology also kinda goes into that. What do you hope to do with that?
It's a great question. I'm not entirely sure
Okay.
what the final product or the final destination is going to be. I want to have the tools to be able to help friends and family foremost, and then secondly to that, help players and mates who are transitioning out of sport. That's kind of where I'm sitting at the moment, and the psychology is a great legitimacy piece. It's a great way to figure out what's actually works, understanding what the studies look like, understanding what's actually going to generally help, instead of just being some person, on social media, just talking about things that might work for some people and might not work for some people.
Right.
I do like the idea of potentially being a clinical psychologist, but then I also like the research piece as well. There's some really great studies that have come out, including circadian rhythm with mental health, physical activity with mental health, breath work and meditation, and go down any pillar that you want to go down. It's really interesting. But long term, I'm not too sure. I think sport is a passion. I think that's always going to be a foundation. But yeah, potentially like clinical psychologist. I love my podcast, man. Like that's
I
that
do
is
wanna talk about that.
that is a passion project. And while I never thought that I would be in media when I was playing footy, like I was that guy that I just wanted to play footy, and they're like, "Keegs, you're up for media." I'll be like, "Mate, just get someone else to do it." Like,
Really?
yeah, yeah,
I'm
well,
surprised by that.
yeah, yeah. Well, it was never really a thing until more recently.
Okay.
The podcast is a year old.
Right.
To be honest, we're only fresh. But the amount of growth that we've had in the last time it's a good validation piece because it means that we're on the right track, I think. And the messages that we've had from people who listen, who get a lot out of it, it's special. And I think that when you hear that, it means you're on the right track. So whether that's in sport or clinical psych or podcasting, I'm not too sure. But whatever that direction is, I think it's going to work out.
Alright, so this is the Whoop podcast. So, I have some questions. I'm gonna put you on the spot. Are you ready? What we got for recovery today?
Oh, actually, I did look this morning. I didn't think you were going to ask, but I did. I am in the green.
In the
I am in
green,
the green.
thriving.
I wasn't in the green when I first flew over from Australia, given the jet lag. It's about 30 hours to get here. We actually made the mistake. We flew into Manchester. We spent a bit of time in London beforehand. And we thought, oh, we'll go out into town and try and stay awake just to get back. And then we end up staying out a little bit too long. And then we're back on Australia time.
Oh,
So
no.
I know it's like, this is probably not great being a human performance podcast. But no, I'm in the green.
I love that.
We had a great weekend.
What do you think? What do you think? Is it just all the good vibes that has brought you there? Because you're saying the game, you've been, like, here at the HQ, you've been hanging with people, a lot of good energy, you got to
Brother.
interview different people.
Brother, Boston is the best.
Okay.
I love Boston. I came into the Whoop HQ yesterday. I got to talk to a bunch of different departments. We're even like being here in the Whoop podcast, like part of the like excitement, like being here. We've had a lot of obviously a heap of comms in the lead up to this
Yeah.
trip. Got to see a Red Sox game, which was awesome, man. Like, I think we're just ticking a lot of good boxes. We're eating some really great quality food. I feel like I'm back in the routine and I'm sleeping so much better now, which is great.
I want to ask like what you're using your Whoop for most. Yeah, I know you said the journal,
Yeah.
but like also what are some other things that you really enjoy about it? Like especially around like mental health, like maybe you're checking off, oh, I'm doing meditation. Then you're like, hey, when I do meditation, I'm like getting a better recovery, or maybe it's things that you're eating, or maybe you're seeing other players that you're working, or you're recommending it to some of the people you're working with. Like, how are you seeing and using Whoop yourself, and then how are you seeing it used amongst your peer group?
The biggest thing that I look at it is for the overtraining aspect of it all, because coming out of rugby league, we're obviously training at a pretty high level. And then since leaving, I was only 24, I'm 27 now. So I love to train. And like we talked about, training is a coping mechanism for me. So I get in the habit of wanting to do too much and probably pushing it too much. So when I am in the red, it's kind of like it's a bit of an excuse for me for that afternoon or that following morning to not necessarily stop, like not necessarily to not do the workout, but maybe just pull it back. Instead of going for a 10K run, I'm not sure what the equivalent to miles is over here, but it might just be a light walk, a recovery walk. So that's definitely the biggest thing that I've seen. In terms of mates who also use it, I think the sleep is a big aspect of it. Like, I'm learning more about sleep consistency and the timing of sleep. I did a really good podcast with Emily Capitalupo, and that was a really cool conversation around like when to go to bed and when to wake up and keeping them consistent. Mate, I learned so much in that conversation. It was great. But that's something that I'm seeing with mates who might not be getting enough sleep. They might just be getting 4 or 5 hours a night and they think that's fine, and that's fluctuating. My really good friends who I have a lot to do with, they're starting to be a bit more conscious of their bedtime.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't track, right?
Exactly, exactly. And then the more conversations that we had a conversation with Dr. Dean Miller around like the lighting before going to bed, around what you can do before bed so you're not so stimulated. And mate, these are such great learnings, and these are actually being passed on to mates within our community. It's like you are the type of person of the people you hang out with, yeah. And so when everyone's sharing these little things, and mate, I'm taking all these learnings back to Australia with me. We're trying to push these out onto the podcast. It's like,
Well, that's it.
yeah, that's the play, man.
Tell us about the podcast, Keegan and Co. Tell us about the reason to start it and maybe like your favorite conversation that you've had so far.
It's a long story. We'll be here all day. No, it's a mental health and sport podcast. Like that's the goal. The goal is to have conversations with athletes who we all look up to in the hope to reduce the stigmas around mental health. And we understand that every conversation is going to be different. Every athlete story is going to be different, but it might resonate with someone and it might validate them and it might give them the tools and strategies to actually help them. We generally want to move the needle, and I think creating awareness and having conversation is great. But how do we make genuine impact? That's what I really want to look at, and that's why I want to give the right tools. And to be honest, when you've got someone who you look up to
Mm.
and they're being open and vulnerable about whatever it is, if they see that, it's like, well, that's cool and that's fine and that's normal, and I'm not weird. That's not a weird thing for me. To be honest, I'm very fortunate that a lot of my friends back in Australia, they're all playing. They're in the best time of their careers at the moment. I'm very fortunate to be able to have these conversations where they probably might not be as likely to be so vulnerable with other people. One of the podcasts that stands out for me was a guy called Braden Maynard. He was a professional Australian rules player for the Collingwood Magpies, a ginormous club in Melbourne, Australia. They won the grand final at the end of last year. A couple of weeks after they won the grand final, we did a podcast. And I remember I've known Braden for a couple of years now. He's a really good fella, tough guy, like known for being one of the toughest players in AFL.
Also a guy you don't want to run into in the alley, I bet.
Big dude, yeah, big dude, man. I remember him talking on a previous podcast about how he was struggling with a few things back in 2017, but he'd never spoken about it. And I'd already spoken to him of what we wanted to talk about through our podcast. But I just called him the night before and I was like, hey, bruz, like I heard about these things in the previous podcast. Is this something that you want to talk about on tomorrow's episode? And he's like, Keegs, like respectfully, like love what you're doing, happy to come on, but it's just something I'm not willing to talk about. Like I talk to my club psychologist and my teammates, and other than that, no one else knows. I was like, mate, fine. Like just the fact that you're coming on is huge in itself. The next day we're in Melbourne, we're mid-podcast, we're having a lot of laughs at the podcast. We're midway through the podcast and he said, Keegs, look, I know last night I said on the phone that I wasn't comfortable talking about what happened back in 2017, but I feel so comfortable here. I feel like talking about it could actually do some help. It could actually help people.
Okay.
And I'm sitting there like, what is it? I'm like, well, what happened? What Brazzy did was he went on to talk about how he struggled with OCD for the last, 7 or 8 years. And his thing was checking. So did I lock the back door? Checking and
Mm.
constantly, and he would do that all night. So he would go into training sessions, semifinals, grand finals. He would not sleep at all. He'd be laying in bed thinking like, what is wrong with me? Like, there's got to be something wrong with me, and he couldn't figure it out. And he actually got super emotional in this podcast, and it really affected him. And then the best bit about that, not only was so open and vulnerable, but he also gave some really good tools and strategies about what helped him. So getting off his phone an hour before bed, so he's not so stimulated. Meditation and breath work was a big one for him,
Yeah.
actually. Talking to his club psychologist, Jackie Lauder, who's also incredible in that space. And then after that podcast, he's like, I feel so good. Like it felt like it was almost like a relief for him. The feedback that we got from that podcast was incredible. It's mum and dads sitting with their child who just got diagnosed with OCD, who's looking up to Braden as an idol. And it's like, well, Braden Maynard has it. Like, you're not any different from anyone else. It's people who had struggled for years, but couldn't validate what they were feeling or what they were thinking and what they were going through. But you've got, the best player in the AFL talking about it so openly and vulnerably. So that episode was one of the ones where it's like, wow, we're doing something cool here, man. But yeah, it was a special one for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, it still keeps going through that thread of like how you've been helping people. And then like now the podcast is also doing like a lot of giving back and also coaching and like helping other people again. So it continues to kind of fall back into that same thing. Thanks a lot for coming on. Thank you for being a member of Whoop. Thank you for using this tool to teach everybody all these great things that you've been learning about and also continuing to spread your good energy around. It seems like you're having a massive impact on your community, on the people that you're working with. And I know that everyone here has definitely felt your great energy. So thanks a lot for coming on the show, and wishing you nothing but the best and everything to come.
Well, Jeremy, mate, hey, thanks for having me on, man. Like you've been really great in the lead up to this trip. Really enjoyed getting to know you. You're a great man, and I appreciate what you're doing, man. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Right back at you. Thank you.
Big thank you to Keegan Hipgrave for sharing his incredible story. If you enjoyed this episode of the Whoop Podcast, please leave a rating or review. Please subscribe to the Whoop Podcast. You can check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. You can also sign up for a free trial for Whoop if you're interested in trying the product. 30 days for free, get the whole Whoop experience. And that's a wrap, folks. We'll catch you next week on the Whoop Podcast. In the meantime, stay healthy and stay in the green.